I said, Esther's a lot darker book than what we often think in VBS, and I hope you've kind of started to see that maybe that darker side of this book, the idea of women being carried in by the hundreds into the these harems and how that went. The period of years they were took away from their families, sequestered behind these walls. It's kind of a bad deal. We saw Esther and her plea, the plea she's beginning to make to Xerxes on behalf of the Jews. And yet, this book will take, to me, another dark twist as we move through it, I believe. Something I've struggled with. There's several things I struggle with in this particular book. No, most people don't. Most people think Esther and they get happy thoughts. Esther's a good queen, and Esther had the pull, and Esther saved the Jews. And really, when you really study this book, I don't have happy thoughts about the book of Esther personally. I just have issues with Esther overall, but nevertheless, uh, to each their own, as they say, right? Um, Esther is going to woo Haman, Xerxes, the feast, the second banquet. Uh, in this, now she's going to make her request known. He's told her up to half the kingdom I will give you. So basically, he said, whatever you ask, I'm willing to do it up to a large portion. And Esther, at this point, kind of brings it against Haman. Let my life be given, for we have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Of course, the king's probably taken back. He probably doesn't even realize that Esther's a Jew, to be honest. Probably has no idea. She's hidden that from him. She's hidden that from everybody. So he probably has no idea she's a Jew. He probably really doesn't know what she's really talking about. He's taken back by this idea. She says, if we'd just been sold as slaves, I wouldn't worry about it. But we've been sold to be annihilated, our possessions to be plundered. I'm beseeching you, who did this, right? And he says, well, it's Haman, right? He's the guy. He's right here. It says Haman. Haman's done it. Haman's plotted against us because of Mordecai. Of course, you got to remember, Xerxes just honored Mordecai. Haman's just led him through the street on his horse. He's honored him. Mordecai is lifted up. King knows who Mordecai is now. That's all come to his remembrance. Maybe that's God's providence. God's not mentioned in the book of Esther, so we just have to take that assumption on our own, whether or not that's God's providence, whether or not that's just how it happened. We would like to think it's the providence of God. We don't have that record in the text. We don't know. But she placed it against him. He was mad. He went for the guard. And Haman knew he was cooked, right? I mean, Haman knew Haman knew the king was against him. Haman knew that he was for Esther. Haman knew he wasn't going to sway the king. Haman saw his plot had crumbled around him. Haman was distraught. He was emotional. He was throwing himself at Esther to try to plead for Esther to give him mercy, to give him his life. This is not a book of mercy. That's one thing that bothers me about the book of Haman. There's no mercy in this book. We talk about the mercy of God and the grace of God, and there just doesn't exist in this book. The Jews are God's people, and yet the Jews are not merciful. The Jews are not merciful towards other nations, towards other people, and that's historically we see that in the Bible. It's true. We know that's the case. We'll get more about this in a minute. But anyway, there's no mercy. She's not going to give him mercy. And when the king comes in and sees him imploring Esther on the couch, he's like, would you even assault the queen? In other words, he took it that, Haman was trying to assault the queen. He was trying to beg for his life. He was distraught. We all know Haman was a vile guy. I mean, the book plainly puts that out. Haman's a vile individual. Haman had evil thoughts, evil intentions, evil plans, was carrying them out, would have destroyed the Jews. We all know that about Haman. Haman was an evil man. But he was pleading for his life, begging for his life. He thought he was assaulting her, covered his face. In other words, they put a sack over him, covered him up so he couldn't see. And the eunuch said, the gallows are there, which Haman made for Mordecai, who Mordecai has been thrust up in the face of the king again. He knows who Mordecai is. They've just honored Mordecai. And he did it for Mordecai, which is another nail in the coffin of Haman, right? And so the king basically says, just go ahead and hang him. So they did. And the king's anger subsided. Seems like fairly good if we ended the book here. Stop the book here. Quit right here at this place. It would seem like a fairly good story, right? God, through his providence, brings Esther to the court of the king. Esther gets the favor of the king and becomes the queen. Esther rescues her people from the evil Haman, and Haman receives his just recompense. Good story, right? If we just stop. Good story. Right, right. Yeah, you're getting into. Right, right, because this edict was still issued. Right, just because Mordecai died didn't mean that edict didn't still exist. So basically, the Jews could still be destroyed. So now we get into Esther part two, right? So that's the VBS end of Esther, right there, right? That's where Esther ends in Vacation Bible School at the point Haman gets hanged. That seems kind of cruel. It seems kind of like a bad way to tell kids, isn't it? But that's where the VBS Esther ends. But the edict, like Sherry says, getting ahead of us, like Sherry does, because that's how she's studied ahead, right? Sherry knows. Um, the edict stands. It's been signed, even though the king's signet ring signed it, not Mordecai's signet ring. So when Mordecai dies, it doesn't matter. The edict still stands. The Jews can still be killed and plundered. That still exists. And so they want to. So the king gives the house of Haman to Esther, and Esther basically puts Mordecai over it. The king gives his signet ring to Mordecai, which that's the power. We've already saw that with Haman. Esther wept, speaks to the king. He says, there's got to be a way to change this. The king extended the golden scepter so she could approach him. We've already kind of said that he had to do that or she'd be killed. So now we got to fix this edict. What are we going to do about it? The king can't take it back. It's like in Daniel, when the king issued the deal that anybody that prays or looks to another god is going to be thrown to the den of lions. When the king Darius found out that was Daniel, he would gladly have just rescinded the order. Said, "Well, I'm not going to do that to Daniel because I love Daniel. I'm not going to do that." But we kind of see how it worked in this kingdom, in this society. The edict couldn't be released. So Darius basically said, "Daniel, I love you. I hate this for you, brother. But guess what? I got to throw you to the lion's den. Hopefully the God you serve is able to deliver you. If not, I've really enjoyed knowing you, and you've done me a lot of good. And sorry we had to do this to you, but anyway, that's kind of the story of Daniel, right? So it's kind of this story here. You can't get rid of the edict. So you got to find a way around it. Well, Mordecai has power now. So basically, Mordecai, he says, let us revoke the letters who wrote to destroy the Jews. For how can I see this happen to my people? And he can't do that, of course. King Ahasuerus said to Mordecai the Jew, I've given the house of Haman to Esther. You write to the Jews you see fit. So in other words, you need to find a way around it and seal it with my ring, which is basically what he did to Haman, because you can't revoke it. So he did, and Mordecai basically says, you're kind of getting Rex's paraphrase of this because I don't think we need to read every word of this. So Mordecai basically, they just come with a plan. And the plan is, we'll just make it where the Jews can defend themselves and kill anybody that tries to kill them and take their stuff. So, like I said, this book takes a dark turn. Let's just kill each other. So basically the thing was, all right, so the people can come against you, but there's a lot of Jews, right? There's a lot of Jews. So he says that the Jews now can defend themselves. You can't just take them. They can defend themselves, and if they rise up against you and kill you, then they can take your stuff. So since we can't take away the order, we'll just let the Jews have the ability to defend themselves. And if the book stopped there, it would probably be all right. It would be a stalemate, right? In other words, you know, if they go to kill you, then you can kill them back. And since there's a lot of you and there's a lot of them and y'all hate each other, you probably should just stay home, right? I mean, you probably should just stay home and just forget this day happened and go to the next day, and then this will all be past and everybody be happy and be alive and the world will be a good place and everybody can smile, right? But no, we're not going to do that. So he gives this order that the Jews can defend themselves. And he does it to all the places and all the languages. Put it with the king's deal. Fastest horses, 3 months, they say, by the fastest horses. To reach all the edges of the kingdom takes 3 months. So they're in a rush because this other edict is fixing to be issued. In a rush to get this out. So they send it out to all the Jews. The fastest horses. Pony Express, right? And then the king granted the Jews the right to assemble, to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. I don't know. I have issues with this book. And the reason is because, you know, this is the world we're in. Right? Hate breeds hate. Anger breeds anger. Right? And I know human nature, like Sherry says, that is our nature. Our nature is to strike back. Our nature is to be hateful. Our nature is to be vengeful. Our nature is to eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You do it to me, I'm going to do it to you. That is our nature. But that is not God's nature. Right? Do you agree with that? That is not God's nature. And in this book, God is never mentioned. What God desires them to do is never revealed. What God's thought about what they do is never revealed in the book of Esther. Right? So all we know is nature. What the nature is. The nature of the Jews and the nature of those around them is their hatred of culture. Sure there is. You've got polytheistic people. You've got monotheistic people. You've got Jews who believe that all of it should be theirs because God granted it to them and it was taken from them wrongly, and they're vengeful and they're hateful and they think that they've been wronged, right? And you've got other people who wish they had just destroyed all those pesky Jews because those Jews are nothing but in the way. And nobody's talking about how all this ought to have been theirs, and they're just a pain all the time, and we need to get rid of these Jews. Was there hate? Absolutely. Was there discord? Absolutely. Was there genocide? Absolutely. Right? You know, all those things we talk about exist in this book. Everything exists in this book. Right? Yeah, but let's get a little further in the book before you make that call. We're not quite to that yet. Oh no, I believe he did. I just don't believe we've got the direct text to say exactly what God's hand or what God approved of and what God didn't approve of. We don't have a prophet, we don't have a seer, we don't have an insight into. The overarching picture, yes. I mean, they see the overarching preservation of Judaism, preservation of the house of David. And I agree, and we see that, and we talk about providence and God's providence. I had an interesting conversation with a guy. Hebrew guy. Hebrew guys are really weird, by the way. They got a whole different way of looking at the world. And I can't speak Hebrew. I don't even can't read Hebrew. I know about 4 Hebrew words or 5 is about all I know. So I'm not a Hebrew guy at all. But interesting, the Hebrew guy was talking about grace and mercy in the Old Testament. And, he says, is there any grace in the Old Testament? Very interesting question. You know, is there mercy in the Old Testament? Christ comes along, and the reason I really bring this up is not really to make you think that God doesn't have a hand in things. I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate this morning a little bit, if that's all right, because I want you to see what I see. I want you to make this distinction between where we're at here in Esther and how many hundred years before Christ are we, Esther? Anybody got an idea about how many years? Jerusalem fell in 486, right? 70 years before they came back to Esther and Nehemiah, right? Malachi was written about 300 BC, 340 BC. We're not quite to Malachi. We're in between. We're right in the middle of Ezra and Nehemiah is where we're at. The rebuilding of the temple, which was 70 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. So 486. So help me out a little bit, right? So we're going backwards because we're in BC, right? We'll take about 70 years off 486 and put you up about, 416, right in there. But we're a little bit past that, actually, because the rebuilding of the temple, if you was with me in my class on Ezra, it took them how long to rebuild Jerusalem? Do you remember that? How many years? 2 decades? 20 years? 20 years to rebuild Jerusalem. So Ezra and Nehemiah spans 20 years. So go to 416, so you're about 400 years before Christ right now. So we're not a millennia before Jesus. We're 400 years before Jesus at this point. So we're 400 years before Christ is where we're at. Well, from a Jewish perspective, there's a lot of grace and mercy. That's right. Yeah. Right. So 400 years. What happens to the Jews in this 400 years? Anybody really know what happens to the Jews in this 400 years? The Jews rebuild the temple. Things go swimmingly for a bit, right? Till about after Malachi, about 250 BC, somewhere in there. They're actually taken over by 2 different groups of people. One of them actually sacrificed pigs on the altar, right? Herod comes into power. Herod, the Roman Empire, comes into power. The Jews never really attained full freedom ever again. Basically, they're under the hands of the Medes until they're under the hands of the Romans. They never really get autonomy. They become more bitter as time goes on, more vengeful as time goes on. They divide into more sects as time goes on, different views of God, different views of how God's working in the lives of Jews. You got the Sadducees, the Pharisees. You got zealots who want to overthrow Rome. You got the Essenes who are hid themselves in the desert. You've got all these different groups, more than we know, of Jews, sects of Jews that arise because they all got different views of God and how God's dealing with the people and how God's going to bring the Messiah and all these different things. I'm just trying to give you a little view of what's going on. So at the time Jesus comes along, are the Jews bitter or happy? Yeah, right? They're pretty fed up. Am I right? It hasn't really gone their way, I will tell you, at all. Especially in the last 300 years before Jesus came, it definitely did not go their way. The temple still exists. They've still been allowed to kind of be Jews, but they've had a lot of, well, First and Second Maccabees is all about the Maccabean revolt, about them All these apocryphal books are about these revolts and these wars, these conflicts, and these things that happen to the Jews. So they're bitter. They're bitter people. And the reason I kind of bring this up is an overarching theme, like Gary sees, is overarching theme of the preservation of Judaism, preservation of David, house of David, I should say, lineage to Jesus. We talk about that a lot. So we get to Jesus, and Jesus comes along and eats with Samaritans and dines with sinners and tax collectors and Romans. And how do you think the Jews are going to take that? You see where we're at? I mean, sometimes we don't understand where we're at, where Jesus is, the world Jesus walked into. The world Jesus walked into is a world of these Jews, the Jews who wanted to kill everybody, but that wasn't a Jew. That's the world Jesus walked into. Right, but when you get to Esther, when you get to books like Esther and you get close to Christ and you see the mindset of the Jews, and then you start to put Jesus into the Jewish picture, which is what Jesus went into, was the Jewish picture. How radical was Jesus? I mean, how radical was Christ? Right? I mean, he was the opposite of everything that they thought he should be. I mean, he absolutely was opposite. Yeah, I cannot answer that question honestly. When the Septuagint became available, I can't. I would say it was under the Greeks, which is a little past where we're at because we're still into the Medes right now. And Alexander the Great's going to come in after this. That's where you're going to get the Greek influence before the Romans. So we're probably a little bit before that. I can't really tell you exactly when the Greek, we call that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew, which is what most Jews used. I mean, most of the Jews at Jesus' time read that. They read the Greek translation of the Hebrew, the Septuagint. A lot of the New Testament quotes are out of the Septuagint, not out of the Hebrew. So we know they used it a lot, but I can't tell you exactly when that translation came into being. I don't know. In this 200, probably around 200, I would say. Yeah, that's probably about right because it's under the Greeks. We're not quite to the Greeks. We're still under the Medes right now. So once Alexander the Great comes in and conquers that, then that's where you get the Greek influence. So we're not quite that far historically. So he puts out this edict, and then they carry it out. The couriers went out. Mordecai went out. Mordecai's dressed in fine clothes. Mordecai's been lifted to a place of honor. Very reminiscent of Joseph under the Pharaoh. I think there's similarities there. Second command. God's wisdom, very similar to Daniel. You like to think that, it doesn't say Mordecai was a wise man, but Mordecai was an honored man. And I'm sure that he received that because of what he had done for Xerxes. He says, for the Jews there was light, gladness, joy, and honor. For the Jews there was, in each and every province, in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment, his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. So we're not always going to kill everybody. We're going to celebrate it. And this is where we get our Feast of Purim. They call it the Feast of Purim. And I think that's interesting too because it kind of also brings us into some New Testament thought, I believe, in my mind. By the time of Christ, there were 4 major fast days, 4 major feast days by the time of Jesus. and that a lot of that had to do, a lot of the fasts and feasts of the time of Jesus had to do with the destruction and rebuilding of the temple, and with Purim, which this is what the Feast of Purim. So, and that's what this celebrated, was their victory over their enemies under the hand of the Medes. So, when Jesus comes on the scene, 300, 400 years later, Jesus comes on the scene, and he talks a lot about their traditions and their traditions and the traditions of men. You know, stuff they bound to be, you have to do it or else. And Jesus was like, no, this is just what you say you have to do. This is man's tradition. This isn't what God said you have to do. You start to see the influx of that coming in at these different things, especially around the time of the temple. I should have brought a list of all that, but I didn't. But Purim was one of those celebrations, feast days of the Jews they kept at the time of Christ that celebrated their victory over their enemies, over the Medes, that existed at the time of Jesus. It was a man-made holiday. It wasn't a God-ordained holiday, but yet they considered it God-ordained. They considered it religious, and if you didn't keep it, you were sinning. You were basically falling out. So that's what a lot of this kind of brings us into where Christ comes in. When Christ said, oh, some of the, a lot of the stuff you teach is just your oil, just your law. It's not God, it's just your stuff. It's not God's stuff. God did command a fast, one fast a year, 1 day of fasting, Day of Atonement. God did command Passover, right? But when we start getting in the Feast of Booths, Pentecost, right? All these other feasts and fast days were basically traditional, like our Christmas, like our Easter, like things that we do. They weren't necessarily, God didn't say you need to do this. So that kind of sets some of the stage for Jesus, what he walked into, a lot of tradition, a lot of stuff that Jesus said, yeah, you do this and it's all great. You observe days and months and weeks, but as Paul would say, but why do you do that, right? In other words, you don't have to do that. So you start seeing this tradition become part of Judaism, more a part of Judaism, and a lot of these feasts and fasts revolve around this particular point in history. And then some of it later on. So a lot of things come up, like we would have, like holidays we would have, and this is what this was, Purim. It says the Jews assembled in their cities to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on the people. Even all the princes' provinces were doing the king's business, assisted the Jews, because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Mordecai was great, his fame spread. He became greater and greater. The Jews struck their enemies, and now you start to see it, enemies, hate, if you look. Enemies with the sword, kind of destroying them. And they did what pleased to those who hated them. And I think that's a really big verse in the whole thought. There was dissension, there was animosity between these groups, between these peoples. Look at the Middle East today. You don't think there's dissension and animosity that still exists between these peoples? This is not a loving place. It still isn't. It still isn't. I mean, it's just how it is. I don't know how to say it. Jesus walked in and taught grace and mercy to people who didn't really, I think, maybe totally understand the concept of grace and mercy. It was a radical view. Jesus was a radical teacher. He was definitely not what they expected. And I think when you read books like this, I think maybe you start to see the environment that Jesus stepped into, and why they were so hostile against him. Sometimes as we read it with our eyes, our 2,000 year later eyes, and we say, how could they be so hateful? How could they be so cruel? How could they be so mean? But when you read this, you start to see that that was a state of mind with them. And it says they killed him a lot. They killed him with the sword. They destroyed. They did what pleased to those who hated them. The Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. The 10 sons of Haman, the sons of the Jews' enemy, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those who killed reported to the king. The king said to Queen, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men. And the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel of Susa, what have they done to the rest of the king provinces? Look at the exclamation point. What is your petition? Of course, there's really no exclamation points in the Hebrew, but translators are trying to give you the view, give you the thought of the passage. Like, wow, this is great. What have they done? You know? And he says, what is your petition? He says, let's do it again tomorrow. Right? It works so good. We killed so many people today. Let's just do it again tomorrow. Let's get rid of all those people that don't like us. Like I said, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate this morning. Read into it what you wish. But I think it gives you a lot of view of the mindset of what's around them. Did God tell the Jews to destroy the people around them, to cleanse? Absolutely. Many times he said that. Many times he says, destroy those people around you, destroy those nations around you. Don't intermarry, as Buck says. Cleanse your house. Unfortunately, the Jews never did that, ever. Never did that like God wanted them to do it. They never cleansed their house. They always had foreigners among them. And yet, in the law, God makes provision for the foreigners among them, does he not? To include them, to let them be part of their feast, to let them be part of Passover. Foreigners among you had rights under Judaism, under the law. Foreigners among them could have rights. That's very unheard of in that society. That was very big in the law, because in any other country that didn't happen. Right? If you weren't a Roman, you had no rights even though you lived in Rome, you had no rights. Right? In the law, God said if there's foreigners in Jerusalem, they have rights. They're not Jews. They can't do what Jews can do, but they do have rights. They do have protection. They do have a place in the society, even if they're not Jews. Here we see, once again, exclusion. Once again, the idea, we're not going to try to get people to know our God. We're going to kill people who don't know our God. So, once again, interesting. I think it's interesting. I think you have to really look at the law, what God intended, God intended the Jews to act, how the Jews acted, what's got us to this point, what's going on here. I think it's a really bigger thought than what sometimes we believe, that we think. A lot of stuff going on here. Esther says, let us do it again. Let's make another edict. Let's do it the next day. Haman's son be hanged on the gallows. King commanded it should be done. An edict was issued. Haman's 10 sons were hanged. The Jews in Susa assembled, killed 300 men, didn't lay hands on the plunder. I think that's kind of the redemptive of the writer, the redemption of the writer. They killed them, but they didn't plunder them. The other edict said they could plunder them, but they chose not to do that. So maybe that's a little bit. And then it said the rest of the Jews in provinces, they killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but did not lay hands on the plunder. So it's a mass genocide is what this is. This is a genocide against those who weren't Jewish, as oftentimes it was a genocide against those who were Jews. But once again, it's the time, it's the mindset, it's what's going on in the heart. It reflects the heart of the peoples that lived, I believe. The hate, the anger, lack of mercy. Yeah. Maybe that was their redemptive side. Well, the plunder, when they killed the Jews, was supposed to go to the king. That was kind of Haman's big plea, let's kill all these Jews and I'll give you a lot of money, right? But so I don't know if it would have went to the king, if it would have been theirs. I really don't understand the significance, but there's definitely a shift between the original and then what happens here. So I don't know if it's the little redemptive side of the Jews. Well, we killed them, but we didn't take what they had. I don't know who took what they had, but we didn't take it. Right. Right. Well, I agree. Hate brings hate. Hate breeds hate. Go ahead, Gary. Yeah. Oh, I agree. From a human standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. And 75,000 people, a lot of scholars say, well, it wasn't really 75,000, 70. It probably was 75,000, but you got to remember, this is a huge kingdom. 75,000 people in this kingdom is not really an exorbitant amount of people if you want to look at it that way from a logistics standpoint. It's not a huge amount of people, but forcing their hand against their enemies. So anyway, I know I've kind of played devil's advocate this morning. I just want to make you think, and I want to make you. I want to give you a different view of Esther. I want you to look at Esther a little different, and maybe study it for yourselves. I don't mean to make it all look bad, but I just think that sometimes we have a real rosy view of this book. We have a real VBS view of this book and a real rosy view of how wonderful all this is. And I just wanted you maybe to see it through the eyes that this really was kind of a cruel and heartless and dark time, and that it wasn't. This is not a fairy tale story. This is a very real, very brutal account of not only persecution against the Jews, but the Jews against other people. And definitely, in my mind anyway, it gives us a real view of Judaism, of the world, to a large extent, the world that Jesus stepped into as our Messiah. He stepped into a world that wasn't very forgiving, for sure. So anyway, just some things to think about. No, I kind of played the wrong side of this, played the dark side of it. You don't have to agree with me, but I just wanted to make you think this morning. So thanks for your time.